Hello, everyone. This is Chapter 12, Feminist Therapy for Counseling 4500. Introduction. So these are the psychologists and researchers that are mentioned in this chapter. Jean Baker Miller, Carol Zerb-Enns, Oliva Espen, and Laura Brown. Core of this therapeutic technique for feminist therapy is gender, social location, so that's like status as well, and also power. It is essential to consider the social, cultural, and political context that contributes to a person's problem. So, in this chapter, what you're going to start to hear about is about how society affects a person's thinking and how they feel and see themselves. Understanding and acknowledging psychological oppression of women and the constraints imposed by sociopolitical status to women have been relegated. So again, what part of that is so important is that we're going to talk a lot about social justice in this chapter. We're talking about gender inequality, but also racial inequalities as well. We're going to explore how men and women have been socialized to accept certain things, such as how it affects identity development. So think about how a woman is raised versus a man. And you can sort of see how there may be more barriers when it comes to being a woman than a man, right? Also, your self-concept, like how do you value yourself because of the way that society has taught us to see ourselves. Goals and aspirations, and then also emotional well-being. Women often are the people who give away their power in relationships without even being aware of it. So, for example, in class, we've talked about the fact that, when a man and a woman, let's say, get married, usually the woman will give up her last name and then just take her husband's last name, right? Why is it that for some people that's not acceptable, right? Other things could be the fact that when a woman gets pregnant, let's say in a family, she usually will just quit her job and probably raise her kid for the next 5-6 years until the child is going to school before she potentially will go back to work if she even does go to work. Okay, current feminist therapy focuses on multiple oppressions, multiple competences, and also social justice as well. Gender cannot be considered apart from other identities related to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, and sexual orientation. So we talk a little bit about the term intersectionalities, where, one person is not just one thing. We're multiple diverse things. Let's talk about the fact that there could be a Black woman with a disability who identifies as bisexual. So there are many ways where people can discriminate against her or celebrate her as well, right? So we want to make sure that we're all thinking about that, and it's not just one thing and that's it, like, oh, you're a man or a woman, that's it. No, there are many layers to it when it comes to identity. All right, history and development. Feminism began in the late 1800s or so. Obviously, there have been people talking about this, but obviously when we're talking about this, we're talking about getting together collectively and starting to actually address it. In the 1960s is when women began uniting their voices, improved shelters for battered women, rape crisis centers, and women's health and reproductive health centers. So historically, when a man and a woman were together and let's say they had an abusive relationship, a lot of times other people outside would say, well, that's a husband and wife thing. That's their personal matter. We don't interfere with those things. They should solve it themselves. And we still sometimes see that happening right now in society, right? But during this time period, we recognize that there is actually things going on that needs to be addressed. So we're talking about shelters, right? For people who have been battered or raped and stuff like that, so that they do have a place that's called safety, and actually be concerned about the women, because typically women are the ones who are abused. Women therapists wanted to move from the perspective that the source of women's problems resided within herself to focusing on social, political, and cultural forces in society. So, for example, I have seen women who have come into my office being very, very sad that they're still single at 28 years old, right? I have seen clients who have said, why am I still alone? Why am I not married yet with children? I feel like such a failure. And a lot of those things are much more social, political, potentially, and cultural than actually, innate. Although definitely, people do want to have children when they're younger and everything like that. But you should not feel like you are less than if you do not get married, let's say by the age of 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever it is. And that's something that is very, very political, very social that we're talking about here. The 1970s, gender research became very popular. So when we say gender research, we're talking about the fact that it's going into academia. So are all these researchers now talking about how gender studies is so important to understand what's going on between men and women, and so forth and so on. In the 1980s, relational cultural model emerged and they explored body image. So we talk a little bit about the male gaze, G-A-Z-E, not G-A-Y-S. So with gaze means like the look of something. When we talk about the male gaze, we're talking about the look that men have upon women. And oftentimes if men say that women look beautiful, if they're very thin, if they have long, straight, blonde hair, then suddenly women may potentially look like that or try to look like that because they are falling into the male gaze. Okay. This is all very superficial in the sense of like, we're introducing you to these topics and stuff like that. Definitely you can go deeper into gender studies and stuff like that and talk about body image. But the fact is, some people do not look like that, that the thin, long, straight, blonde Barbie look at all. So then there could be people who now become very, very upset, depressed, hate themselves, and then, maybe even develop eating disorders and all that stuff because of this expectation from the male gaze or from society itself. All right. Also talking about abusive relationships, eating disorders, incest, and then sexual abuse. Philosophies that are included in the second wave of feminism are liberal, cultural, radical, and social feminists. And we're going to explore these in the next couple of slides. Okay, the first is the liberal feminist, helping an individual woman overcome the limits and constraints of traditional gender role socialization patterns. So being allowed to kind of like, be aware, to be awoken, let's say, to understanding that, society does expect women to behave a certain way, and also men as well, too. But here we're talking about specifically women. Once work and social environments become bias-free, the differences between men and women will be less problematic. And of course, this is theoretical. We're hoping that it will go there because as we can see, it's no longer the 1980s or 60s. And it still exists to this day, right? So a lot of this stuff does take a long time before we can break down these social ideas that we have when it comes to men and women. But I definitely do see this in millennials and Gen Z, where, girls are not necessarily expected to do certain things anymore, that they are told that they can do certain things. But not everyone in society agrees with that. So the goal for liberal feminists is personal empowerment of individual women, dignity, self-fulfillment, share power in decision-making in relationships, and equality. And older therapies that have biased views on women. And we've talked about this. It's not that the therapies are terrible. It's the fact that certain of those therapies develop in a generation where women were seen as almost like second class or treated as second class. So we want to challenge those ideas, or maybe not even use those components of it, but maybe use other ones. We've talked about Freud in this way, where people do find Freud problematic, especially women find him problematic. However, there are certain ideas that he has brought up that are not necessarily problematic. Let's say ego defense mechanisms and stuff like that. But having penis envy or, having this kind of like construct or concept that you are less than because you don't have a penis, those things might not necessarily go very well in, let's say, today's modern times. All right, cultural feminists. Oppression stems from society's devaluation of women's strengths, values, and roles. The goal here is to feminize the culture so that society becomes more nurturing, intuitive, subjective, cooperative, and relational. So let's kind of break down a couple of these words so we understand. So oppression stems from society's devaluation of women's strength, values, and roles. So even though women are able to handle a lot of things, society doesn't necessarily allow them to, right? And part of that is if you don't allow them to do it, then, you know, you're basically devaluing all these things that they have. So here we're trying to add feminism into, or femininity into the world. So that means being much more nurturing or loving. Intuitive, that means like kind of like, you know, naturally how it feels, like how you want to do these things. Subjective is kind of your personal perspective on this situation. Cooperative means helping, and relational meaning socialization. So right there we're talking about being much more helpful with each other instead of being so competitive with each other. Interdependence over individualism, which is what I just basically talked about. Interdependence means depending on each other to lift each other up. All right, radical feminism. So typically, whenever I talk about this class, you know, someone is going to think about the fact that feminism, they think of radical feminism, which is kind of like an angry, upset lesbian woman who doesn't shave her armpits and burns bras, right? And that's one sect of it. And, you know, there are people who believe that by protesting, by talking about this and being active, you know, and spreading the word, it finally shares it with everyone to make them realize what's going on. So for this sect, a lot of times people see that they're very confrontational, and then that has kind of like a negative stereotype when it comes to women. Okay, so radical feminism is oppression of women that is embedded in the patriarchy. Patriarchy basically means kind of like male dominated, and seeks to change society through activism and equalizing power. Questions the way in which patriarchy dominates every area of life, including household chores, paid employment, intimate partnerships, violence, and parenting. So let's just break down a couple of those things really quickly as well. Household chores. Did you know that there are male household chores and female household chores? Why is it that that has to happen? And again, with Gen Z, with millennials, I think you're able to spread those things or share those things evenly without having to gender everything, right? Like you know, taking out the trash is very masculine, right? For back in the olden days, that might have been it, right? And raising children or doing laundry or cooking was very womanly. So there we're challenging those things. Paid employment in the sense of men and women should be paid the same for doing the same job. Okay, but even to this day, women and men do not make the same money for the same job. You all, as a young person who's entering into kind of like, let's say, food service or cashier type stuff, those things might actually be similar between men and women. But as you get older and as you go into higher ranking, it's a lot more apparent that women get paid less than men. Intimate partnerships, violence, and then, of course, parenting as well. Okay, question the many ways women are denied power. So why is it that women cannot do certain things or are getting paid less? So we want to talk and question those things. And the goal for radical feminism is to transform gender relationships, transform society or societal institutions, and increase women's sexual and procreative self-determination. So even to this day, we talk about abortion rights, right? And this is what we're talking about here, is to say, you know, why is it that we don't force men, let's say, to get a vasectomy so that women don't get pregnant? Why is it always the women's responsibility? And if she doesn't want to have a baby, that she can't, you know, keep it if she wants it, or not keep it if she doesn't want it. Whereas a man can get someone pregnant and then leave and then disappear and then that's it. So there is a double standard when it comes to things like this, and radical feminism really does bring this into the forefront to discuss. All right, socialist feminists share radical feminists the goal of societal change, focus on multiple oppressions, and believe solutions to society's problems must also include class, race, sexual orientation, economics, nationality, and history. So we're bringing in some of that intersectionality that we were talking about earlier, right, with the socialist feminists. They want to change society, in different ways through this, but through work, through education, through family roles that affect their lives. And the goal of socialist feminists would be transform societal or social relationships and institutions. So, for example, in this picture that you see here, women's restrooms, let's say at a baseball game or something, during the intermission can be very, very long. And it's so unfair that men can go back to their, let's say, seat and enjoy the rest of the game, while some women will miss the game because they're still in line waiting for restrooms. So why don't institutions like, a ballpark create more restrooms for women, or more toilets, more stalls, more sinks and all that stuff, so that it becomes more equal, right? We know that women take longer to go to the restroom. So then why not accommodate those things, right? So that it is fair for both, so that one doesn't get to suffer for like basically missing part of the game or the concert or whatever it is. Well, this is something that's already very obvious that this happens, right? And then in the 1990s, there's a third wave of feminism. This included women of color, lesbians, and postmodern and constructivist viewpoints. All right, so let's talk about that. All right, postmodern feminists model of critiquing other traditional and feminist approaches, addressing the issue of what is reality and proposing multiple truths as opposed to a single truth. So now we're talking about going past the ideas of feminism that were in the second wave and really questioning all those critiques, because society is also changing at this time as well. Women are being seen differently or see the world differently as well, with more rights and stuff like that. Reality is embedded in social relationships, and historical context is socially invented, is reproduced through power and relationship. So when it comes to feminists, you can be whatever woman type that you want to be. So if you want to be a traditional housewife, you can, and that's totally great. But if you also want to be a single woman who is a lesbian, or maybe not even a lesbian, and just never want to get married, you should be able to do that as well, right? So we're talking about multiple ways of being right or good or having an authentic life. Because before that, there was really, there's one way to be a woman and one way to be a man, right? And so for here, we're talking about multiple truths as opposed to just one single truth. Women of color feminists. Feminist theory has been broadened and made more inclusive. Women of color have criticized some Caucasian or white feminists of overgeneralizing the experience to fit the experiences of women of color. So if you ever watch feminists talk, you'll sometimes see that there are ones who are very traditional white feminist women who talk, and they sometimes talk about everyone. But the truth is, a woman of color will have a lot more things that they have had to deal with that white women do not. And one of that is, racism, discrimination, and oppression of that sort. Okay. And then how about people who are, let's say, identify as lesbian, or whatever it is? There's now multiple levels of it. And so women of color feminists want to bring those things also to attention as well, because a black lesbian feminist is going to experience things differently by the society than a white straight feminist. They challenge multiple oppressions, an assessment of access to privilege and power, to recognize the importance of spirituality, and also emphasize activism as well. Global international feminists, worldwide perspective, and seek to understand the ways in which racism, sexism, economics, and classism affect women in different countries. And yeah, because there are countries where women are not allowed to go to school, even know how to read, cannot drive cars, all these things, because part of it is to keep women helpless, right? Dependent on men to be able to do certain things. Like, imagine if you could not read something or write something, right? You're going to need to ask someone to do it for you. And so for some cultures, those are things that feminists will talk about. All right, let's talk about key concepts of views of human nature. And I just wanted to introduce to you some of the vocabulary words so that you can see what we're talking about when we talk about gender studies and feminism. Okay, does not allow the traditional theoretical frameworks that focus on androcentric. Andro basically usually means men, centric means in the middle of. So androcentric means male oriented or male-centered constructs to draw conclusions about human nature, which means that we're going to judge society how a man sees things. Gender-centric is proposing two separate paths of development for men and women. Heterosexist, we've talked about heterosexism before, viewing a heterosexual orientation as normative and desirable and devaluing LGBTQIA orientations. Deterministic is assuming that personality patterns and behaviors are fixed at an early stage of development. So we hear about the word deterministic with Freud because Freud, remember, a lot of his stuff focuses on basically birth until about 12 years old or so. And after that, it's already been determined to you because of this younger stage of development, right? So they're saying is that you want to challenge those things, that people can actually grow and become a person after 12-ish or so. All right, intrapsychic orientation is attributing behaviors to internal causes, which often results in blaming the victim and ignoring sociocultural and political factors. So intrapsychic orientation basically means is society has expected you to do certain things, and because you can't do it for one reason or another, you hate yourself. You think it's all your fault, right? Okay, the goal is to be gender fair, flexible, multicultural, interactionist, lifespan oriented. Here's some other additional vocabulary words here. Gender fair approaches. Okay, explain differences in the behavior of women and men in terms of socialization processes rather than on the basis of our innate natures, thus avoiding stereotypes in social roles and interpersonal behavior. That's a lot of words, right? But basically what that is saying is that men and women are raised as children to see the world very differently, and they're expected to behave and all that stuff are all expected when they're young. And so we're trying to say is, let it be that if a child, let's say a boy wants to play with dolls, he should, and you should not make a big deal out of it. And if a young girl wants to play, let's say, football or whatever, that you don't necessarily say anything. There's sort of also a double standard when it comes to things like that, because girls can play kind of boy games and it's like, oh, she's just a tomboy, it's okay, whereas if a boy plays with more feminine things, it's immediately labeled as being gay, right? Or what's wrong with him and stuff like that. So there is kind of a double standard when it comes to that. And we want to think about how that should not exist. All right, flexible multicultural perspective uses concepts and strategies that apply equally to individuals and groups, regardless of age, race, culture, gender, ability, class, and sexual orientation. So just, to be able to incorporate all these things together so that we don't necessarily always expect those things to be the reasons why we're discriminated against. All right, interactionist is contain concepts specific to the thinking, feeling, and behaving dimensions of human experience and accounts for contextual and environmental factors. So let's review that. Contains concepts specific to the thinking, feeling, and behaving dimensions of human experience and accounts for contextual and environmental factors. So what that means is depending on the situation, how people act, okay? And we want to be aware of how that is. All right. Lifespan perspective is assume that human development is a lifelong process and that personality and behavioral changes can occur at any time rather than being fixed during early childhood. So basically going opposite of the deterministic perspective that we talked a little bit about before. So it's lifespan perspective. Whenever you hear the word lifespan in psychology, it means from birth to death, basically. Okay? All right, this is the end of the first lecture. Thank you.